Imagine if you discovered that the bloodiest war in human history until then was, in fact, a debt consolidation operation disguised as a political conflict. Think about that for a moment. 20 million dead, 4 empires destroyed, the world map redrawn. And in the end, only one group truly emerged victorious: American bankers. In the next few minutes, you will discover how World War I was not about territories, nationalism, or even the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It was about something much simpler and much more sinister: debt consolidation on a global scale. Here's what should make your blood boil. While millions were dying in the trenches, a small group of financiers in New York was orchestrating the largest transfer of wealth in human history. And they used the war as a smokescreen. This is not a conspiracy theory. These are documented facts that have been buried for over a century. And when you understand how it worked, you will recognize the same pattern being executed today right in front of you. Prepare to discover how to transform a European debt crisis into American financial domination, and why this playbook has never stopped being used. To understand the biggest financial operation in history, you need to go back to 1914 and see Europe as it really was: a bankrupt continent disguised as imperial powers. Here's the kicker. In 1914, all the great European empires were technically insolvent. Not financially troubled, insolvent. The British Empire owed the equivalent of 2.3 trillion in today's money. Its colonies did not generate enough profit to pay even the interest on the imperial debt. France had spent so much financing colonial expansion in Africa that 67% of the national budget went to interest payments. 2/3. Imagine if 2/3 of your salary went just to pay credit card interest. Germany was caught in a compound interest trap. It had taken out loans to finance industrialization, then more loans to pay off the first loans, then more loans to pay off the second ones. Sound familiar? The Austro-Hungarian Empire was the worst of all. It was paying 89% of its revenues just in foreign debt interest. 90%. It was mathematically impossible to continue functioning. But here's where it gets interesting. Who were the creditors? They were not other countries. They were private banks, mainly American. They were not other countries. They were private banks, mainly American. Between 1900 and 1914, J.P. Morgan, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and other Wall Street banks had lent the equivalent of $847 billion in today's money to the European empires. And in 1914, these loans were becoming unpayable. Think about that for a moment. American bankers were facing the biggest default in history. Unless something drastic happened, they would lose everything. So something drastic happened. A war. Now, I'm going to show you exactly how to turn a default crisis into global financial domination. It's a 3-step process that is pure evil genius. The moment the war began, something extraordinary happened. All European countries did the same thing. They started printing money to finance the war effort. But here's what they don't tell you. This money was not used to buy weapons. It was used to pay debts. I'll give you a concrete example. In August 1914, England lent $100 million to France to buy military supplies. But this money never left London. It went directly to American banks as payment for French debts. France did the same with Russia. Germany did with Austria-Hungary. It was a giant circular scheme where printed money was used to pay American creditors. Here's where it gets really interesting. The war needed to last long enough for all the debt to be monetized, but not so long that it completely destroyed the debtors. And who controlled this duration? The same bankers who were creditors? J.P. Morgan had representatives in all belligerent governments. Not as spies, but as financial advisors. They literally controlled how much money each country could spend on the war. When Germany tried to make a decisive offensive in 1916, suddenly its credits were cut. When France wanted to negotiate peace in 1917, suddenly it received more funding. The war was controlled by cash flows. And here's the most brilliant part of all. The peace treaties were not about territories. They were about debt restructuring. The Treaty of Versailles is the perfect example. Everyone focuses on the reparations Germany had to pay. But no one asks, to whom were these reparations paid? They were not to France or England directly. They were to American banks that had financed the reconstruction. Germany was paying reparations to American banks that lent money to countries that fought against Germany. It's the perfect debt consolidation scheme. Transform multiple unpayable debts into a single giant debt guaranteed by international treaties. Now I'm going to show you who really won World War I. And it wasn't the Allies. Before the war, 1914, J.P. Morgan had 78 million in assets. Kuhn, Loeb & Co., which had 45 million. National City Bank had 2.3 billion after the war, 1920. J.P. Morgan had 1.2 billion in assets. Kuhn, Loeb & Co. had 890 million. National City Bank had 47 billion. That's a 2,000% increase in 6 years, during a war that killed 20 million. But here's the kicker. These banks not only recovered their loans, they became creditors to entire countries. After 1918, England owed American banks the equivalent of 280 billion. Germany owed 120 billion. Suddenly, Wall Street controlled the finances of all of Europe. And here's the most sinister detail. These loans had compound interest clauses that ensured they would never be fully paid. Think about that for a moment. American bankers created a system where entire countries became permanently indebted. Financial colonialism disguised as international loans. Now here's where the story becomes terrifyingly relevant to your life today. The same system never stopped working. Let me show you how the 1914-1918 playbook has been used repeatedly. World War II, 1939-1945. Same structure. Europe gets into debt. America finances. America controls the post-war. Result? Bretton Woods. Dollar becomes world reserve currency. Cold War, 1947-1991. Same structure. Countries get into debt for defense. American banks finance. Result: IMF and World Bank institutionalized debt restructuring. War on Terror, 2001 present. Same structure. Countries get into debt for security. Banks finance. Result: surveillance state financed by perpetual debt. A pandemic, 2020 present. Same structure. Countries get into debt for public health. Banks finance. Result: largest wealth transfer in history. Every single time, the pattern is identical. Crisis, indebtedness, financial control, power consolidation. And here's what should make you furious. You're paying for this. Every time your government gets into debt to solve a crisis, who receives that money? The same financial groups that created the crisis. And who pays the bill? You, through taxes and inflation. It's the same debt consolidation scheme, just scaled up to include the entire planet. Let me give you the tools to recognize when this playbook is being executed. First sign. Countries or regions with unsustainable debt suddenly facing emergencies that require more indebtedness. Current example, Europe, with 95% of GDP debt suddenly facing an energy crisis that requires trillions in new loans. Second sign, every solution to crises results in more power for financial institutions. Current example, every response to crises in the last 20 years has resulted in more power for central banks and less for elected governments. Third sign, aid packages that are actually loans with compound interest. Current example, Green New Deal, which is essentially a $1 trillion debt scheme for banks that finance clean energy. Fourth sign, small players being eliminated during crises, leaving only large institutions. Current example, small banks being absorbed by giants during financial instability. Here's the truth that's going to change how you see everything. You are not living in independent countries. You are living in subsidiaries of a global financial system. Your government does not make decisions based on what is best for you. It makes decisions based on what is best for its creditors. And its creditors are the same groups that profited from World War I. Think about it. Why does your government always have money for wars but never for infrastructure? Why are banks always saved but you lose your home? Why does national debt only increase, regardless of which party is in power? Why have the same financial families controlled central banks for over 100 years? Because the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. World War I was the beta test. Now it's the global operating system. And here's the scariest part. Every crisis makes the system stronger and you more dependent. So, what do you do with this information? First, stop expecting politicians to solve problems that bankers created. They work for the same bosses. Second, understand that your personal financial strategy must be based on the reality of the system, not on official propaganda. This means protecting yourself against debt monetization, inflation, diversifying outside of assets controlled by the banking system, understanding that emergencies are opportunities for wealth transfer. Third, recognize that knowledge is power only if you act on it. The bankers of 1914 knew a crisis was coming, so they positioned themselves to profit from it. You can do the same. Here's your action plan. First, study how wealth transfers work during crises. Second, position yourself on the right side of the next emergency. Third, stop being a debtor and start being a creditor. Fourth, understand that the game is not about money, it's about control. The brutal reality is, the debt consolidation system that began in 1914 now controls the entire planet. Every country, every government, every central bank is trapped in this machine. But here's the good news. When you understand how the machine works, you can use it to your advantage. The Wall Street bankers were not smarter than you. They just understood the game better. Now you understand too. The question is, will you continue to be a piece on the board, or will you start playing the game? Because while you were discovering this, the clock didn't stop. The next crisis is already being prepared. The next debt consolidation is already being planned. The only difference is that now you know how it works, and knowledge, applied correctly, is the only real form of freedom in a system designed to keep you indebted. The game hasn't changed in 110 years, but now you know the rules. And when you know the rules, you can play to win. Welcome to the real game. Time to start playing.